violence on our Utah communities and our panel discussion. My name is Jade Velasquez, and I'm a board member of the Gun Violence Prevention Center of Utah. Thank you for joining us this evening and taking time to learn about this extremely critical issue in our state. As we gather in this space to learn about how the proliferation of guns have impacted specific communities here in Utah, I'd like to take a moment to remember and honor the victims and survivors of gun violence across our country, and to recognize the public health crisis that gun violence in the United States has become. Tonight, you'll be hearing from 6 different panelists who represent different populations and communities that have been impacted by gun violence. We will be hearing from Bené Larson of the National Alliance of Mental Illness, the Utah chapter, Jen Oxborough of Allies with Families, Jessica Burnham of the YWCA of Utah, Gracelyn Bonham of Utah March for Our Lives, Stephen Swenson of the Davis County Sheriff's Department, and Lex Scott of Black Lives Matter Utah. Our panel tonight is going to be monitored by Billy Palmer, the awesome radio host of KRCL's Radioactive. And before we get to our panel discussion, we want to share a message with you from Greg Jackson, the Advocacy Director of the national organization Community Justice Action Fund. Greg currently leads the national advocacy efforts of Community Justice Action Fund. He comes from the Washington, D.C.'s Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. In this capacity, Greg oversees community events and outreach activities, policy development, violence reduction programs, and direct engagement of residents most at risk of gun violence in Washington, D.C. Prior to this role, Greg served as the Director of Communications for the D.C. Department of Parks and Recreation, where he led the mayor's Fit D.C. initiative to ignite movement of fitness and wellness across the district. So for the last 4 years, Greg's professional efforts have been focused on achieving a safer, stronger Washington, D.C. community in multiple capacities after surviving an act of gun violence in 2013. So now you'll hear Greg's story and hear about the grassroots gun violence prevention with which he has been engaged. Let's hear from Greg.
Hello, I'm Gregory Jackson, the Advocacy Director for the Community Justice Action Fund. Thanks for having me here today, and I'm really excited to share a little bit more about my story, the work that we're doing at Community Justice, and how to bring about change to end gun violence in Black and Brown communities. I come to this work not by choice. In 2013, when I was leaving a family gathering, I literally was shot as a bystander of a argument or conflict that was happening across the street. And unlike the movies, for me, being shot was not something you just brush off and move forward with. For me, while I was shot in my leg, it damaged 2 arteries. I spent 21 days in the hospital, 6 months in recovery, and went through 6 different surgeries to get back on my feet, literally. And there was a couple really traumatic but major things that stood out to me in my experience. The first thing was when I was picked up by the ambulance, I was met at the hospital, not by my doctor, not by my nurses, but by 3 investigators. And I had to navigate through their questions before I could get the health care that literally would have saved my life. When I was shot, then I finally met my surgeon. He said that I had only about 20 minutes to live for fear of bleeding out. And I had lost precious minutes talking to investigators as opposed to getting the health care that was needed. The second major thing that stood out to me, when I was shot, it was right after Newtown and Sandy Hook, and we literally have watched children being slain in their own schools. And my frustrating realization was watching politicians look at gun violence as a political football and not the public health crisis that we all know it is. And so that's something that stuck with me and encouraged me to want to take action. The third thing that stood out to me was my doctor said that every day, young Black men like myself come through those hospital doors with similar wounds, and they go back into their neighborhoods, back into their communities, back into their homes, and sometimes back into the same buildings where they were harmed without any major change. And so with all that said, I committed to doing something about it and being a part of the change that needs to happen to end gun violence in our communities. I joined the Community Justice Action Fund because we are committed to ending gun violence in Black and Brown communities by centering policy solutions and narrative changes that focus on the communities that are most impacted by gun violence. In America, over 100,000 people are shot or killed by guns. And when you look at the homicide rate specifically, over 70% of those individuals are Black or Latinx. In fact, gun-related homicide has now become the #1 cause of death for Black men under the age of 44. The #2 cause of death for Latino men under the age of 44, and the #1 cause of death for Black women under the age of 19. We're also seeing huge jumps in the suicide levels in Black and Brown communities by firearm, especially coming out of this COVID-19 epidemic. And so every major instance of firearm or gun-related violence is intensified in Black and Brown communities, and it's only getting worse. But there are solutions. Across the country, we have seen numerous cities, city officials, communities come together and really focus on public health oriented efforts to prevent gun violence before it happens. So what do I mean by that? I mean investing in solutions, programs, and funding sources that address the root causes of gun violence. Root causes such as housing instability, access to healthcare, access to fair and equitable education, but also direct resources that target those who are most impacted. Across the country, we've seen a few major trends. First of all, someone who is likely to commit a violent offense was first a survivor in most cases. And so one of the most obvious ways we can bring about change is investing in resources and programs that service survivors just like me to avoid them retaliating or falling down this cycle of violence. The second major thing is investing in programs that address those who are most at risk. Programs like Advanced Peace in California, programs like Life Camp Inc. in New York City that provide resources, services, and most importantly, support for those who are most at risk of being a survivor or potentially an offender of gun violence. Another key solution that exists is investing in violence intervention and prevention programs, organizations that actually intervene when there is the likelihood of conflict between two individuals or multiple groups, and de-escalate that through trauma-informed approaches. The last one is investing in programs that are really focused on supporting the entire ecology of a neighborhood. That means making sure that not only are the schools in a good place, but housing is in a good place, and that all individuals throughout the community, whether it's a family member or someone directly impacted, are being resourced and supported as they transition through a community that may be already plagued with violence. So those are the type of solutions that we're pushing for. In multiple states, we've seen leaders step up. Places like Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois. We're starting to see leaders really step up and prioritize investing in these types of programs to address gun violence before it happens. These programs are key because they proactively address gun violence before the police have to be called, before the ambulance needs to arrive. And that type of forward-thinking, preventative approach is what we know is impactful. We've also seen in certain states the community leading the charge. In places like Maryland, a coalition came together of Marylanders, whether they were people who worked in hospitals, community members who were in neighborhoods impacted by gun violence, and even some of the violence intervention and healthcare workers. They came together to form a coalition of 40 organizations. And that coalition advocated directly to members of the state legislature, the state house and state senate, went to briefings, did petitions, did phone calls, did in-person visits, and then also organized their own briefings and tours of those legislators to see how these programs are working on the ground. All of those efforts came together to allow Maryland to pass in the state legislature for 2 sessions in a row funding for these violence intervention and prevention programs. And so I will say that not only are these programs important and not only are they impactful, but we're seeing the community lead the way to bring about that change. So I hope that that will be something that will inspire you and your community or your fellow residents to come together to fight for these proactive solutions. In closing, I'll just share that there are so many ways that we can address this crisis of gun violence, whether it's addressing the root causes, improving access to healthcare, or just cutting off this flood of guns that are flowing into our communities. But most importantly, we need to bring about change, and that starts with you. There's no such thing as small change. There's so much that needs to be done that anything that you jump into to address this crisis may have a major impact because so little is being done at this time. So hopefully you'll join us in this fight, and feel free to reach out and follow our organization, Community Justice Action Fund. We're on all social media at CJ Action Fund. And you can always go to our website, cjactionfund.org, to learn more. So thank you so much for being a part of this and for being committed to addressing this major crisis in our country.
Thank you so much for that incredible story, Greg. We're so grateful for you in sharing your story and the work that you do with the Community Action Justice Fund with our gun violence prevention community tonight. So before we get to our panel discussion, I just have a couple of helpful instructions. Our panel will be responding to several questions and prompts from our moderator. And following that discussion, there will be some time for audience questions from to the panelists. So if you have questions that you'd like to pose, they can be submitted through the comment section on our live stream platforms on YouTube and on Facebook. You can also post a question anytime during the panel discussion, and they will be considered during the question and answer portion at the end of our program. So our moderator will present those questions to the panelists. So if your question is specific to a particular panelist, make sure to let us know. So now I would like to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel. Billy Palmer is a host and associate producer of Radioactive, which is a public affairs show that highlights grassroots activism and community building on KRCL 90.9 FM, where he also serves as Director of Community Engagement. He has been a community organizer and friend for more than 15 years, advocating for human rights, youth empowerment, neighborhood reinvestment, and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Last fall, Billy was the recipient of the Pillar of Hope Award from the Rape Recovery Center in Salt Lake City. And also, he is the proud father of 3 young men. So with that, Billy, the time is yours.
Thank you for that, Jade. And yes, we have been friends for quite some time, and I'm glad to be here with you. I'm glad to be here with our panel, and I want to thank the Gun Violence Prevention Center of Utah for putting this together. This is an important conversation to have. We need to have more of them, absolutely, for sure. And this will help people to understand ways that we can advocate to prevent gun violence, especially in our legislation that's coming up later on this month. So as Jade mentioned, we have a great panel here, and he did mention their names. I will run through their names one more time for our audience, and then we will ask them a question as they introduce themselves as well. First, we have Jen Oxborough, Allies with Families, where she's the executive director, and Gracelyn Bonham, March for Our Lives Utah. Gracelyn is on the executive committee there. Jess Burnham is at YWCA Utah, and she works in prevention. Lex Scott, Black Lives Matter Utah. If you don't know who she is by now, you've been living under a rock. She's on CNN, Fox News, and on your local stations all the time. Stephen Swenson, Davis County Sheriff's Department, is here with us, and we want to thank him. And then also Bené Larson, who's at the National Alliance on Mental Health Illness Utah, or for short, and I'll be using that acronym all the rest of the night, NAMI Utah. She's the Director of Prevention by Design. So in order of those folks, I have a question for each one of you as you introduce yourselves. And that question is, no longer in my hands. Okay, here we go. The question is, tell us how gun violence has impacted you and the community you serve or that you represent. And for some of you, we realize this is your community that you serve and you represent as well. So give the audience a little bit of an introduction of yourself, what you do with the organization that you're at, and also please answer that question. Jen Oxborough from Allies with Families.
Thank you very much, Billy, and thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to the organizers of this. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of things tonight and this important conversation. I work in the community for many years now as a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a mom to two young adults that have been raised in Salt Lake City. And professionally, I spent about 5 years in professional victim advocacy as the executive director of the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I left recently and joined Allies with Families, which has been around since the 90s. And we partner with the Department of Human Services and several different organizations across the state to bring services to families in crisis, about 1,200 families per week. So this is an issue. Gun violence prevention is an issue that's very near and dear to our hearts, especially when it comes to domestic violence, homicide, and suicide, which disproportionately affects all of our families in Utah and takes a tremendous toll on our communities as well. We have the 5th highest suicide rate in the United States in Utah, and middle-aged men who have access to firearms are the most likely to die by suicide in Utah. Our domestic violence homicide rate in Utah is at least 42% of all of our homicides, and that's back to the year 2000. So that's been a bad problem for us in Utah for a very long time. Through partnership, we're starting to see some improvements in that area. There's a vast array of stakeholders who are teaming up on this, but this issue of gun violence prevention is something that we're thinking about around the clock, and we know we can do better with these sorts of partnerships and these opportunities to talk about it. So thanks again for having us here.
Thank you, Jen Oxborough, and thank you for what you do. Gracelyn Bonham, just so our audience knows, is also a co-host for the show that I produce and host on. She is with March for Our Lives Utah, and she will be presenting parts of this conversation, clips of this conversation on next Thursday on the 28th. So if you want to introduce somebody else to this conversation, that's a good opportunity to do it on KRCL 90.9 FM, 6 o'clock. And you'll be able to hear from Gracelyn once again. But Gracelyn, why don't you go ahead and answer that question as well?
My name's Gracelyn. I'm part of March for Our Lives Utah. I'm on the executive team. I've been with March for Our Lives Utah since about March of 2018, right around its conception. And I'm a junior in high school, so there is a lot of gun violence that does affect me when it comes to school shootings. But personally, this is also the reason I joined March for Our Lives, is that my family's been affected by gun violence in an extreme kind of way, where my sister is a survivor of the Las Vegas mass shooting that happened in October of 2017. So that was a really difficult time for our family and my sister, just living through something so horrible as that. And it definitely opened my eyes as to like what the issues were with the gun problem in our society, especially when coming from a place in Utah where there are a lot of gun owners and sometimes not all of them are safe. But so that has affected my family and me personally quite a bit. And my community that I represent, which would be a lot of the youth or the LGBTQ plus community, and where I live, there are a lot of gun violence victims when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to school shootings specifically. That is something that affects the youth immensely.
Thank you for sharing that, Gracelyn. We really appreciate that, and we should appreciate the violence that many of our young people are experiencing. We're all connected in a lot of different ways to this violence, and some of us more directly when things like that happen. So we appreciate that you're willing to share that and for what you do as well. Up next, we have Jesse Burnham from the YWCA Utah. Thank you for being here, and thank you for what you do. And go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Billy, and glad to be here with everyone tonight and in good company with everyone on the panel. So my name's Jess Burnham. I'm the Prevention Program Manager with YWCA Utah. I received my master's degree in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Rutgers University last January. And for the past 3 years, I was a violence prevention researcher at the Rutgers Center on Violence Against Women and Children, where I supported research on campus climate related to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and then also led a concept mapping study to understand how best to mitigate violence, harm, and oppression across 3 campuses toward racialized racial minorities and folks minoritized by gender and sexuality. And prior to that, I was the prevention education coordinator with Safe Harbor Crisis Center. And so prevention work is in my blood at this point, and just very excited to be here and to talk about this very, very weighted issue. I'm also here tonight because firearms are the most commonly used weapon to murder an intimate partner in the United States. And because the YWCA is one of the most comprehensive providers of family violence services in Utah. So we offer an array of services and resources to both help individuals who are being victimized by an intimate partner, and then my program, which focuses on primary prevention, focuses on preventing intimate partner violence from occurring in the first place. We also offer 24-hour emergency shelter, case management, economic empowerment, mental health services, childcare and after-school programming, as well as support in obtaining stalking injunctions, SANE exams, lethality assessments, legal aid, and just that piece of providing community violence prevention education throughout the Salt Lake community area. So to put gun violence into the context of our organization and those we serve, just in the year 2020 alone, of the 647 clients who completed danger assessments through the YWCA's Family Justice Center and residential programs, 32% of individuals reported that their perpetrator owned a gun. And it's significant to note that risk of intimate partner homicide increases by 5 times or more when a violent intimate has access to a gun. And then of those whose perpetrator owns a gun, 52% reported the perpetrator has threatened to use a weapon of some kind against them. And of those threatened with a weapon, 51% reported the weapon was a gun. And then again, intimate partner homicide again increases by 4 times when a victim survivor has been threatened with a firearm or other weapon by an intimate partner. So thank you for having me, and here to advocate for folks at risk of and experiencing intimate partner violence.
Thank you. We're grateful for you coming, and we look forward to having more conversation as well with you. Lex Scott, Black Lives Matter, was all Black Lives Matter organizers throughout the country. We're very, very stacked with work last year. And so we want to thank you for all the work you've done over the last year. It's been an awful lot of work. And we want to also say that it's good to have you here on the show as well. So thanks, Lex Scott, for coming. And let's leave you to introduce yourself to the audience, and please answer that question as well. And I'll remind our listeners, if you've just come on, the first question we had was, tell us how gun violence has impacted you and the community you serve or represent. Lex Scott.
Thank you for having me. And Billy Palmer is one of the few hosts that actually covered the Black Lives Matter movement before it became trendy. I called Terry tonight and I said, Terry, just full disclosure, you know, I'm a strong proponent of Black gun ownership. And I always have multiple guns on me. And she said, yes, they would still like my point of view. So I feel bad sitting on this panel with gun violence victims, but I will just say on our end over here, you know, we wish that guns did not exist. And if there was a way that I could wave a magic wand and get rid of all of them, I would. However, in the position that I sit in with constant death threats and the Black community being hunted by white supremacists in 2020 and 2021, I encourage all of my members to own weapons responsibly. Responsible gun ownership. And I believe that you can be a gun owner and push for sensible gun laws in this nation. How it has affected Black Lives Matter is in several ways. Obviously, the police violence, police murdering 1,000 people on average per year in the United States. Utah, the gun violence rate here by police fluctuates up and down, But obviously, most of us have read the article by our Attorney General, who said he was shocked at the amount of police shootings. The Black and brown communities in Utah have never been shocked by that. That is a constant norm. Another way that it affects the Black community here are the victims that we help. So for example, we have a 17-year-old, Brandon Parker, who was playing with a gun with his best friend. The gun went off. Now this happens all the time in white communities. And people understand that these are horrific accidents. However, Brandon Parker is now going down for murder 1. So we also wish that people would be responsible in their gun ownership. If they choose to own a weapon, we want people to not own weapons in homes where people are at a high suicide risk. We want to make sure people buy gun safes and gun locks and have crucial talks with family members before they purchase these things. And we want to make sure that Black and brown victims of gun violence and perpetrators of gun violence aren't receiving higher sentences for lesser crimes or higher sentences for what their white counterparts are just being let go for. So that's where we stand on it. And I had to tell you, I do own weapons.
Thank you for that, Lex Scott, and for your candor. We can always count on that. Next up is Stephen Swenson from the Davis County Sheriff's Department. Stephen Swenson, thank you for being here with us tonight. And let's let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, as I said, my name is Stephen. I have about 6 years of law enforcement experience, spent a little bit of time in corrections before moving out on the road and work as a patrol officer. And before I start, it's important to note that while I am affiliated with the Davis County Sheriff's Office, I'm not here on their behalf. Anything I say tonight is not representative of them. I'm not on the clock right now. I'm not getting paid. It's just merely an affiliation I have, and I'm not representing them, and nothing I say tonight is representative of the Davis County Sheriff's Office or their opinions or anything like that. So that kind of disclaimer being said, I have seen gun violence kind of firsthand. I've responded to suicides. I've responded to murder. I've seen kind of just general crimes committed with firearms. I've arrested people with firearms. So I see the kind of danger it poses in the community. I see the just the kind of day in, day out type of thing with firearms, the stuff that doesn't make the news, the stuff that we don't hear about, and just how commonplace firearms are in the community, both for self-defense, for hunting, for recreational shooting, for many different things. And so gun violence, I'd say, has impacted me kind of in that way where I see it and I'm trained to just kind of always be on guard and always be watching out for someone with the potential to shoot me or my partners or kind of that type of thing. And that kind of some of the things I've seen and done has taken a toll on my mental health and has led me to seek some therapy and get some help for that. But it's also made me kind of a strong proponent of gun violence and making sure that people are responsible gun owners and people know that the danger that firearms have in the community. So thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your perspective as we realize that, even police officers, when we think about communities, they are a community of folks, and they do see gun violence in many different ways. So thank you for that. Earlier, I mentioned about coming to the show. I don't mean to say that. That is a conversation that I'm so used to saying because I do a radio show 5 days a week. So I do realize this is not a show. And so before I get any emails, I'm taking this very seriously, but I'm just used to saying the word show so often that it just came popping out of my mouth. I'm going to avoid that for the rest of the night. So the last of our panel to introduce is Benet Larson. And Benet is going to share some numbers with us as well. But Benet, the question was, tell us how gun violence has impacted you and the community you serve or represent. And I will leave it to you. Benet is from National Alliance on Mental Health Illness, Utah, or excuse me, NAMI, Utah. Thank you.
It's a long word. I know, lots of acronyms. I'm so grateful to be here tonight. Thank you, Billy, and all the panelists. I'm excited to be here and hear your different perspectives tonight. My role at NAMI Utah like Billy said, is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Utah chapter. I oversee a grant from the state of substance abuse and mental health. And this grant is over suicide prevention, and the grant then therefore awards many grants across the state for suicide prevention. So I oversee 15 grants across communities, anywhere from Ogden to Kane County, across the state, southern, central Utah, Utah Navajo Nation. So I get to see how gun violence touches each portion of our state when it comes to suicide and suicide prevention. And then I also am the co-chair of the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition. And so I get to participate in the preventative side for suicide prevention across the state. And then my NAMI side, I get to advocate for individuals with mental illness or family members who have a mental illness. And often on the mental illness side, individuals with mental illness are often those who have violent acts towards them due to their mental illness, due to the stigma associated with mental illness, and that portrayal that people who have severe mental illness are violent, and that is not true. And usually it's the flip side, that they are the ones that are receiving violent threats against themselves. Only 4% of violent acts across the US are attributed to mental illness. So as far as suicide goes, it affects multiple facets of what I do and the communities which I serve. Suicide by far is what I talk about most with gun violence, because here in Utah, it is a large part of why we have such high rates of suicide. I think Jen mentioned, Utah ranks in the top 10 in the United States for death by suicide. 86% of our firearm deaths here in Utah are with a firearm or suicide. And if you look at this graph that they just put up, that's always amazing for people to see, that most of the deaths by firearms here in Utah are not homicides. They're not individuals protecting themselves. They are actually suicide deaths. So just think about that tonight as we have this discussion about 85% of suicide attempts with a firearm are fatal, as opposed to all other used methods. So it's not necessarily that people who attempt suicide with a firearm want to die more than someone who maybe attempts in another way. It is just a far more lethal way, and there's no going back. So that is kind of just who I am and what I represent. I'm really grateful to be here representing not only NAMI Utah, but the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition and those who I get to associate with across the state that are passionate about suicide prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Bené Larson from NAMI Utah. And that is our panel, folks. And so we will get into the conversation a little more. Feel free to jump in when you feel like you need to, as we are on a Zoom. You know that we want to wait until the other person's done talking. And when we get back into regular rooms, we can just talk, and that'll be nice, won't it? How has the proliferation of the easy access to guns affected the population you serve and represent? When we talk about guns, we have to talk about the proliferation, how many guns there are in this country, as well as the ease of access to them. Very important question that we want to ask right off the bat here. And if there's anybody that wants to jump in on that, go ahead and let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to call you up. So I'm going to go to Jen Oxborough. Jen Oxborough from Allies with Families.
Thanks, Billy. I just quickly want to point out, working with families, both as a therapist, as a victim advocate, and trying to provide a range of services to families in crisis every week. It's important to understand sort of the fabric of Utah. So we have the highest birth rate per capita in the country. Like, we have a lot of babies. I'm a super lightweight. I only have 2, but most people in Utah have 3 or 4. And we have the lowest earnings for women per capita in the country. And so we have a lot of disproportionate control sometimes within our families. What that means is that when we're looking at a system that's under-resourced with domestic violence and sexual assault services, social services overall, that people who are in violent, dangerous situations, like many of the panelists have described, they can be very reliant on the abusive partner. And if that partner has access to a firearm, that's sort of pouring fuel on the fire in my view. So because we are a state that has such a high gun ownership rate, and because we have so many children, and because we are so under-resourced with these important life-saving services, this is an issue that needs to be taken very, very seriously. And I am not anti-gun either, Lex. I appreciated your honesty and being so so transparent about that. I'm not anti-gun. I'm just pro-safety. And I inevitably get death threats about these things too. I am not here to step on anyone's constitutional rights. I just want our families to be as safe as possible. And that's what we're really advocating for in all of our roles. I want our communities to be safe. I see the toll too. I debrief law enforcement. I have been for 10 years through the CISM program. And, you know, I see the toll that it takes on them. I've talked to just about every family over the past 5, 6, 7 years who have lost someone to gun violence through an act of domestic violence homicide, which is most frequently followed by a suicide when there's a firearm involved. So those tragedies are just devastating all around. And so I want to see what we can do as a stakeholder group, as a community that comes together to solve what I believe to be a preventable public health issue. And that's what I really care about at the end of the day, is safety.
8 years ago and 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, and this past year, gun sales have skyrocketed because of the scare of people taking away guns from people that are gun advocates. Let's go to you, Jess Burnham. Did you have some comments about the proliferation and the ease of access to guns?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. And thanks, Jen. I think YWCA Utah, I know YWCA Utah is with you in prioritizing the safety of our families and communities. To your point, Billy, I would offer that according to Allen and colleagues, homicides have been on the rise in the United States since 2010, which has prompted concern over that widespread availability of guns to get at that proliferation issue. And according to the Small Arms Survey that was released in 2018, there has been a global growth in civilian gun ownership, but that is largely attributable to the rising gun ownership in the United States, which now has approximately 120 firearms per 100 residents, which seems wildly excessive to me. And while Utah has laws in place that prohibit firearm purchase or possession by those who have perpetrated domestic or dating violence, these laws are not effectively enforced. So for example, restricted persons remain able to purchase firearms through private sellers who are not required to complete background checks in the state of Utah. So that is to say and to emphasize that victim survivors remain at high risk. And I'd like to provide a few national statistics to provide some scope of the issue. But I would also like to reiterate that the mission of our organization of YWC Utah is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And in line with this mission, our family violence services are available to anyone who has experienced violence or who is at risk of experiencing violence. However, research does suggest that some communities are at higher risk of intimate partner violence and homicide than others, not due to any fault of their own, but because of the systemic discrimination of racism, sexism, heterosexism, cissexism, and structural inequalities. So for example, to just illustrate, those populations at greatest risk. So we know that women are many times more likely than men to be killed by a current or former intimate partner. Approximately 4.5 million women in the United States have had an intimate partner threaten them with a gun, and nearly 1 million women have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Women of color are nearly 3 times as likely to be murdered with a gun than white women, and Black women are shot and killed by a husband or an intimate partner 3 times more often than by male strangers, and most often during the course of an argument. In addition, research suggests that LGBTQIA+ individuals experience similar, if not higher, rates of intimate partner violence compared to their straight and cisgender counterparts. And according to a report by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, guns were used in 59% of hate-related and intimate partner homicides carried out against LGBTQ people in 2017. And of these homicides, 71% of those murdered were people of color, 52% of these individuals were transgender or gender nonconforming, and 40% were transgender women of color. And I would like to note that minoritized folks are also much less likely to report to formal sources or actually attempt to access services for a very real fear of discrimination and the experience of further violence.
So I'd love to hear a response from anybody. That I saw a lot of head shaking, nodding up and down in our moderated on our guest speakers. So who would like to speak to that? All right, I'm just going to have to pick on you. Oh, Stephen Swenson, as we see this proliferation of guns and the access to guns being so easy, and as we saw in the how quickly things can turn on police officers when we looked at that insurrection that are we allowed to call it an insurrection at the Capitol, and we watched in horror as we saw a lot of police officers in a lot of danger, and it seems like it's very fortunate that we didn't lose more officers. So what would you like to say to that?
Thank you, Jess, for those statistics, and Jen for your comments as well. The interesting thing I find kind of in the community I serve is that guns are kind of a way of life. Either they're hunting or they're just typically kind of conservative people and strong Second Amendment supporters, and they feel almost having a firearm in the home is kind of part of their identity as a person and identity as kind of an American. And it's interesting that it's just so easy. They go out, it's the kind of common thing to talk about with your friends and neighbors and things is what kind of new firearm you have or what hunting you did, and kind of your political views on that, and launches into kind of a lot of other discussions. So I think that's the biggest thing kind of I see, is just I don't see a lot of the actual crimes and stuff. I mean, I do see them, but I don't work in a very kind of major metropolitan area with a high crime rate and that type of thing. So I just see more the kind of day in stuff of how many people have a concealed carry permit, how many people are carrying guns, and how many people have guns in the home. And we know that through statistics and through studies and things, the higher exposure to guns, the higher exposure to firearms and the use of them, just having a firearm in the home actually dramatically increases the potential for violence inside the home. A lot of people think it's going to be used for self-defense or an intruder or something like that. But more likely than not, the firearm in the home will be used either by someone against themselves for suicide or for interfamily and domestic violence and that type of thing.
Thank you for that. Gracelyn, I see you nodding your head an awful lot there, so I want to give you an opportunity to jump in on this. What's going on for you in this conversation?
Well, with March for Our Lives specifically, there are 2 main ways in Utah that people get guns without a background check, or people get guns that they're not prohibited. People can get guns through online sales through private sellers without a background check. There are not a lot of restrictions for private sellers. And that is a big issue because then it allows prohibited people or people who are planning to do something bad, whether it be towards themselves or towards other people, it allows them to get access to a gun that they're not supposed to have because there's no background check. Another loophole would definitely be the gun show loophole, which works similar because they are also private sellers. But it's extremely easy for any individual to get a gun through those methods because of the fact that there aren't a lot of background checks or there aren't a lot of checkpoints in order to get that. There's no waiting period. There's no background checks, and because of that, it creates a lot of issues when it comes to violence against minorities, specifically people of color. I believe that they are 15 times more likely to experience gun violence or gun assault than any other group of people. And that's a big issue because minority groups are a lot of targets of gun violence. Specifically, in the past few years, there has been a rise in hate crimes towards people of color, women, and LGBTQ plus people. And when that happens, we are, as a community, failing to protect the people that need it the most. Because when we allow violence to occur towards those groups of people, we are not showing that they mean something, that they matter to each other, ourselves and to each other. And so I think that the easy access to guns creates a lot of other issues in and of itself. And also the fact that Utah does not have a lot of open resources for victims when it comes to like easily accessible for every group. So when it comes to the fact that these guns are easy to get, it creates a lot of victims, but there's no victim resources to help, especially people of color or women. So I think that it kind of leads to a snowball effect where one bad thing leads to another bad thing, which continues and continues, and the cycle doesn't break. So I think that prevention of access for prohibited people or people that shouldn't get a gun is definitely where a lot of focus from March for Our Lives is.
Lex Scott, I'm Black, you're Black. You know, the statistics keep coming up about how people of color are disproportionately affected by gun violence. And, you know, just growing up, this is not new to a person who is Black to be aware and be on alert that when gun sales go up, when fear goes up, when those types of things happen, that we have a feeling that we will be one of the first people affected, and we worry about our children. We worry about our own lives when we see the proliferation of guns and all of that. So this is not new. This crisis of gun violence to our communities, and since we're mentioning this disproportion, let's hear from you.
Yeah, and let me see. Can you hear me? Okay. I originally bought my first gun because I noticed that every time someone was killed by police and they had a weapon, they would pull their criminal background and the police would say, well, he had a gun. And then as an excuse, as if Black people don't have the constitutional right to bear arms and the right of self-defense. And I wanted every police officer to see me holding a gun. And then I realized how easy it really is to buy a gun. It is easier in the state of Utah to get a gun than it is to get a driver's license. To get a driver's license in the state of Utah, you need a birth certificate, you need an ID, you have to take a written test and a driving test. If you walk into any gun store, you basically sign a little paper. They run a background check. If they can't find anything, you're ready to go and you have your guns, and that's extremely dangerous. But yeah, when we see that hate crimes have gone up 800% in this nation, I'm encouraging all the members of Black Lives Matter to buy guns. And what I found was they were very afraid to buy them because the stores that sell these guns are often owned by white supremacists who are flying, Blue Lives Matter flags and Confederate flags. And so that's why we do gun buying field trips to go to teach them how to be a responsible gun owner, buy gun locks, buy gun safes. And I always give a lecture of, hey, don't if you have people whose mental health isn't the best, then please don't bring these in your home. But when Grace was talking, I was just thinking about March for Our Lives and how horrific it is that we live in a world right now where kids have to do mass shooter drills in school. And Graceland actually has a family member who was a victim of the Las Vegas shooting. And so it's just, we've turned into a world where, yeah, I believe I need one. I'm Lex Scott, but I also believe that this world is so insane with the amount of gun worship. That's another thing that we participate in the United States.
Gun worship. That's that is a really good and direct way to describe it, I would say. Thank you for that, Lex Scott. Bené Larson, let's go to you real quick. I think Jen Uxborough has one more thing to say, so we'll go to her right after. So as soon as she's done, Jen, go ahead and jump on in, but go right ahead.
Right as my dog decides to bark. I've agreed with so much of what everyone has said. And one thing I want you to all understand or know is, as far as we're concerned with suicide deaths in Utah and NAMI national stance and Utah, that I know that guns are not going to go away tomorrow. And that is not the answer. The answer for us is the public health aspect of it is keeping people safe. And here in Utah, we have 50% of households have at least one or more guns. And we've shared other statistics where it's, higher rates. People don't just own one gun, they own massive amounts of guns, because that is like Lex said, it's a worship mentality for many people. And we get that. People hold really closely their Second Amendment right. We are so encouraging individuals to be responsible gun owners and store and lock their guns and ammo up, especially if you can separately. And when you have an individual in your home or a family member or friend or somebody that you know that has access to a gun and is going through a hard time or a trial, to ask to take those for them and keep a hold of them or keep the ammo for them so that they can be safe until they get through their crisis. Because we know most of the suicide deaths here in Utah, especially with a gun, happen in a short period of time where crises are very brief. Often, I think, let's see the numbers, like 75% are an hour, no more than an hour, but 50% are like 10 minutes or less. Somebody is going through a crisis and they can't see a way out, but they have access to a gun and they don't have time to rethink those things through because that gun is lethal. And so thinking about those things, that we have guns in our homes, how are we storing those guns and how are we keeping our families safe? Just, one other quick statistic, 80% of firearms used in youth suicides here in Utah belong to their parent. And so, especially here in Utah and rural Utah, usually those firearms that are used in suicide deaths belong to the family member. And often youth in rural communities are able to use a shotgun for those suicides. So we need to be teaching proper storage of our firearms and keeping our family members, our children, our youth safe. So many people think their children know how to use a firearm, and they do, but they don't have those hard conversations about what to do when life gets hard and how to get out of tough situations. And so I think that having firearms around us is not going to go away tomorrow or next week, unfortunately, but teaching those communities we serve in and our friends and our neighbors how to properly store them. We give away gun locks. We have, there are programs within our state where you can go to the library and get a gun lock. I know some of the communities in which I give that I am over the grants, they often will give lock boxes away, or there are programs in where you can get access to lock boxes or gun safes for a pretty discounted rate. So I know that there are ways that we can be better and do better to make our community safe. And I will turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks for letting me chime back in. Just something Lex said a minute ago, and I appreciate the comments of everyone, but it is really easy to get a gun in Utah, and it's about to become easier if Representative Brooks' HB 60 passes. It's heading to Legislative Committee on Thursday to the House Judiciary Committee. And what it would do is remove the state's requirement for law-abiding Utahns over the age of 21 to have a permit to lawfully carry a concealed firearm. What concerns me about that is central to this conversation. When we take away that permitting process for a concealed carry permit, we give up access to really valuable suicide prevention and safety training that those permit holders get as part of that permitting process. And, you know, that's 160,000 people a year that get that training. I don't think there's any one magical solution to preventing some of these tragedies that we're talking about tonight, but I sure do value how that community has embraced this training. And I think it has helped us start to level off our suicide rates and even drop some of those suicide rates over the past couple of years. I was a part of the Department of Human Services when Prevention by Design was initiated. And so I'm so excited to hear that it continues and that people are working together to try to find better solutions in teamwork. And I'm really worried about HB 60 for that specific reason, that I think it takes away this really essential part of suicide prevention and safe gun storage, responsible gun ownership, that has helped us to drop some of those rates and improve safety overall. So I wondered what the panelists might think about that too.
Thank you for that. And we have about 15 more minutes before we go to audience questions. And we have 2 more questions, so let's keep that in mind. And of course, we can sort of expound on some of the things we want to say as we listen to audience questions as well. We're going to get to a conversation about legislation in the 4th question. And the 3rd question will be coming up in just a second. And just so our panel knows, there is a question in the audience about extreme risk protective orders as well. So we'll get a chance to talk about that specific issue as well. So this next question, you heard from our featured speaker from Washington, D.C. on how gun violence has affected him and what he and other organizations decided to do about it from a grassroots community level. What do you envision would be a helpful community response to the gun violence that your population experiences? And to start off, we'll go with the grassiest of grassrootsers here with Gracelyn Bonham and Lex Scott. So Gracelyn, you're the youngest in the crowd too, so let's give you a chance to talk first, okay? Gracelyn, thank you.
All right, thanks. So I think specifically grassroots organization is in conjunction with legislative training and legislative work is really, really important, especially in Utah, because grassroots organizers have been the basis of almost all of our political movements, or almost all of our legislation has started in grassroots movements. Specifically we working with Moms Demand Action, and they're a grassroots organization that pushes for gun safety, especially when it regards youth. And I think that grassroots organizers can provide a lot of services to prevent gun violence from happening in the first place. Just like what Benet said was mentally ill people, when giving them services and giving them ways to connect with their community and connect with others who have the same issues that they do, or have the same mentality that they do, and not only just mentally ill people, but youth and the LGBTQ plus community and people of color, connecting them with services that will help them in a grassroots level will allow them to connect more, and it will definitely prevent a lot of things. Just like Greg from Washington said, he was talking about how the housing disparity, the food disparity, poverty, all of those things lend themselves to gun violence. And on a grassroots level, organizers can work to assist their communities to prevent all of those things from happening and to prevent further crime, which usually presents in gun violence. So grassroots organization in providing services for minorities and just the community in general really help prevent gun violence.
Same question to you, Lex Scott, March for Our Lives Utah.
So me personally, my number one focus is stopping gun violence at the hands of police. And so what I have asked for, and I have been told is too expensive, is I have pushed for less than lethal weapons in every patrol vehicle in police cars in Utah. And what I mean by that are beanbag guns and rubber bullet guns. And I was told I'm very expensive because I also want them to all have body cams. And the chief of police of Salt Lake did remove 70 lethal shotguns and replace them with less than lethal shotguns in their car. And as we know, the majority of police brutality victims are experiencing some kind of mental health crisis when they are shot or killed by police. So I asked the legislature for a bill that would fund all of those rubber bullet guns because tasers are not effective. I don't know if you guys have ever seen a police taser work. I haven't. They're garbage. And another thing that would be amazing would be to disarm the police completely. There are nations, developed nations across this world where the police do not have guns. Only their special SWAT teams have weapons. And I pitched that as well because Utah has one of the best SWAT teams in the nation. They shoot less people than most other SWAT teams. They use lethal force as a last resort, and they refuse to go into houses where they know there are weapons and where they know someone is trying to commit suicide by cop. Suicide by cop should not be easy. It should not be easy to accomplish. So again, I push for less than lethal weapons. I push for disarming the police completely. And I believe that my dream will come true because the maker of Axon makes all the body cameras for police. The owner of Axon, or the CEO of Axon, said he will come out with a less than lethal handgun in the next 10 years that will replace 90% of police handguns. So I do believe in our near future, we will have one of those. And then, you know, hopefully just try to affect legislation and advocate for March for Our Lives, you know, anything, getting rid of the AR-15s. And I want to let you know, I've gone to the gun store a million times. They have really pretty AR-15s. And every time I see one, I think of March for Our Lives. And my husband said, why won't you buy an AR-15? And I said, because March for Our Lives is trying to get them banned. And I want to support them in that.
Stephen Swenson, knowing that you don't speak for the Davis County Sheriff's Department, which does for you to be able to give your opinion here, disarm police, disarm the public, AR-15s, Lex Scott just brought up. Let's hear from you.
First off, I appreciate the work Lex does. Police officers don't want to shoot people. And so anything we can do to try and prevent those situations is a good thing. It's interesting you mentioned tasers and things. I'm actually a taser instructor. I've been through training for that and teach that regularly. And tasers have their place. It is a tool that we should carry as police officers, but they have their kind of specific niche and they have their spot. And they are very different than a firearm. They have different uses than a firearm. They cannot replace a firearm. And that type of thing. So they're the kind of a less lethal thing, and they can be useful in the right situations, but the right situation is hard to come by in some circumstances. As far as disarming the police, I can't speak about the culture of America versus the culture of other developed countries, specifically the amount of guns that these citizens own in America as compared to other countries. I don't know what the rates are of the USA versus England or Australia or New Zealand or anything like that. And so I personally am not comfortable going out and doing my job knowing how many weapons are out there against me without something to defend myself. if it's something that as an entire community we can work on and reduce kind of guns all around, I think that is a potential good thing. But as far as kind of disarming the police and replacing it with some sort of technology item or that type of thing, may be possible in the future, but right now seems like a very dangerous thing for everybody involved. It is unfortunate when people are shot by the police. There are times though where the person that is shot is not just they aren't being shot just in defense of the police officer, but in defense of someone else. And I would hate to be in that situation where I am forced to use lethal force to defend someone else and not be able to carry out that task because of the technology and some sort of microchip failure or something like that, whereas a firearm has no kind of electronic element to it. And then just one last thing about AR-15s. I know, again, I can't research all the statistics for you right now, but I know that most crimes and especially most mass shootings and that type of thing are actually committed with handguns instead of assault rifles. And so I don't really have an opinion one way or the other about AR-15s, so much as I just want the conversation to be directed in the right place.
So thank you for that. You know, AR-15s, I think I've shot them, and honestly, I had a blast. I was surprised at how much fun it was. At the same time, while I was shooting it, I realized nobody needs this. Is what the only thought that was going through my head. That's just my humble opinion. I'm just one person, and that is not, a statement to say anything but. Absolutely, I had a blast doing it, but at the same time, I realized there is just no reason for any single person to have this. That was just my comment on that. Okay, so I'll leave that there. But Jesse Burnham, would you like to answer to this question? What do you envision would be helpful community response to the gun violence that your populations, the ones that you serve, experience?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. And I'll be quick. I know we're short on time, but as a violence preventionist through and through, I really wanted to just quickly touch on this issue. We know gun violence is linked to intimate partner violence, and I think that Mr. Smith touched on the need for our communities to really work towards the primary prevention of gun violence. But unfortunately, because of the Dickey Amendment, which was passed in the 90s, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which all of our violence prevention initiatives as a nation come out of, has been restricted from researching anything having to do with firearm violence for the past 20 years, which has loosened a bit. But so my focus is on what we know more about, which is the risk and protective factors for intimate partner violence, which are often committed with a firearm. So primary prevention approaches are those that take place before violence has occurred to prevent initial perpetration or victimization. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have identified a series of prevention strategies based on the best available evidence. And one of these strategies is teaching safe and healthy relationship skills to youth. And our prevention program at YWCA Utah uses the 4th R curriculum, which is incredibly comprehensive, universal curriculum for middle school and high school students that helps them identify their values and boundaries, identify the qualities of a good friend or partner, the dynamics of healthy versus unhealthy relationships, warning signs of dating violence, communication skills, and how to take responsibility for our emotions, and among other competencies. So one thing that individuals watching could do today is reach out to YWCA Utah and try to bring our prevention programming into your schools if it's not already present. I know a lot of the school districts are implementing social emotional learning curriculum, which is so important in building empathy and just emotional competency. Another prevention strategy advanced by the CDC is bystander empowerment in education, which is another point that I believe Mr. Smith touched on.
which gives everyone a role to play in ending violence in our communities by insisting that it's our collective responsibility to keep each other safe, and by providing skills-based workshops on how to intervene directly or indirectly before, during, or after a potentially harmful situation. And YWCA Utah also provides education on the Upstander curriculum, which was created by the Utah Department of Health. So folks can also reach out about that, but those are two primary prevention strategies that really are looking towards the long-term eradication of violence in our communities.
Thank you, Jess. So we have one more question for our audience before we go to for our speakers before we go to our audience, but we've also promised to get to our audience. So I'm going to do this. This next question's on legislature. So I'm going to combine a few of the audience questions in there to keep in mind as we answer these questions, because they do somewhat connect and relate. So one of them is, which Utah legislators are more open to actually making changes to Utah gun laws? Another one is, how would an extreme protective order law affect the community you represent or serve? For some people, they may need some explanation. So I know there's a few people on this panel that can speak to that really well. And then also, what rights come with rights come responsibility? Should our lawmakers help make our community safer by making or getting guns more stringent? So with those questions in mind from our audience, finally, this is the fourth question that we had designed for this panel. What specific policy measures could Utah legislature take to effectively help the problem of gun violence in our Utah communities, and particularly the population you serve or represent? And Jen Axbar, we haven't heard from you recently, and I know you can speak to some of these policies that have been brought up by our audience as well. So let's go to you.
These are such good questions, Billy. Thank you for letting me chime in. I think that in my experience, if you can find a way to start a conversation about safety with your legislators, almost all of them want to have that conversation. They may have different ideas about how to improve safety, but when we start getting into a whether people should have guns or not conversation, it usually shuts down pretty quickly. But if we can stay oriented to the thing that we value, which is what I'm hearing is safety, most legislative leaders that I have worked with over the years in Utah are very receptive to that conversation. In my experience, they appreciate text messages, especially this year. It's a very strange year. So because of the virtual nature of the general session, which started today, text messages are a great way to get in touch with them, especially through their interns. An extreme risk protective order is an ex parte order of protection that is a civil order of protection. We have looked at running that a couple of times in Utah. Representative Handy, who's a Republican, was interested in running that to try to get upstream and try to help, as many of your guests today have talked about, preventing these tragedies, keeping them oriented to medical intervention, making sure that people get help and we avoid a criminal implication for someone, which could permanently restrict them from gun ownership for a lifetime. But as you can imagine, when we start talking about even a temporary restriction for someone who's at risk, people that are very motivated to preserve gun rights get very upset and worried about that. And so we have a lot of work to do on that. As a mental health professional, I work with people who are suicidal quite frequently. And a number of times we have intervened and tried to hold guns for people to interrupt that most dangerous cycle of violence. We don't often have a legal means aside from pink sheeting someone, civilly committing someone and taking away their right to live independently in the community. So I'm really hopeful that we have some sort of mechanism eventually to help us all attain safety and prevent someone from intersecting the criminal justice system when they're in crisis. Let's keep it medically oriented and get them the help that they need. So those are my thoughts on that. That was quick, and I'd welcome additional feedback offline too. If I can ever support anyone, please reach out to me. I'd love to have this conversation.
Thank you for that. ERPOs, I don't know if it's going to be on the legislative docket this year. If any of you do know, but does anybody want to talk to one of our audience questions about ERPOs?
I don't believe that it's going to be run this year. I think Representative Handy has shifted his focus elsewhere. And I think they are taking some time. Those that are interested in extreme risk protective orders are taking some time to work with some of the police chiefs and sheriffs who are interested in this, to do it in a way that is careful and thoughtful and doesn't step on people's rights. So I think they're taking some time to review that and study it before they introduce it again. And I think that's responsible, actually.
Okay. For Steven Swenson, there's a question specifically for you. When you pull up someone's ID for a moving violation or home incident, does the information include whether they have a concealed carry permit? If so, what increased measures are available for your safety if permitless carry becomes law?
That's a great question. Thank you. So whenever I am interacting with someone, whether it be a traffic stop or a call for service, or I'm talking with you on the street, the information I'm pulling up is your driver's license record. That has your name, address. I can identify you. In addition to that, it also does a check for Utah warrants, as well as a check on the national, the NCIC, the National Criminal Information Center, which is the kind of national database of protective orders and warrants from out of state and that type of thing. And on your Utah driver's license, there's a big kind of red heading at the top that says concealed carry permit if you do have a concealed carry firearm. And I can scroll down and I can see if that's active or not based on the expiration date listed on your concealed carry permit. So for me, I like seeing that information because it tells me that someone is carrying a gun. And typically the people who take the time to get a concealed carry permit are the ones who are more interested in kind of self-defense and are not typically the criminal element who are using it in their criminal activity and drugs and that type of thing. And so if a permitless carry event happened, I think more people would carry firearms because they would feel comfortable doing so legally. And I think more criminal element and that type of thing would be carrying it because they don't need an excuse anymore. And so it kind of places me a little more heightened risk, and I would have to be just kind of a little bit more cautious about everybody I'm meeting with, and just kind of there's no warning sign or anything like that as to who would carry a gun and where they're hiding it on their person or in their vehicle or anything.
Thank you for that. And I know that I don't mean to go rapid fire here, but I want to get as much in as possible. Bené, Larson from NAMI, Utah. You wanted to speak to, I believe, I'll let you go. HB 60. You wanted to circle back to that. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, Jen mentioned it earlier in the conversation tonight. There is a new bill that Representative trying to think, Walt Brooks from St. George has drafted, that it's a concealed carry firearms amendment, which would take away the need to have a concealed carry permit. And Jen kind of touched on it earlier. For those of you who don't know and aren't aware, we had legislation passed a few years ago in conjunction with the Department of Health that anybody in the state who applies for a concealed carry are required to take a concealed carry permit class. And part of that class that has been in conjunction with the sporting council is a suicide prevention class. And Jen mentioned 162,000 people took that class in 2020 alone. And then there was additional legislation attached to that anybody who renews their concealed carry permit has to take that class now. So it's this amazing tool that we have for prevention, to prevent individuals who are buying guns and who have concealed carry permits, who want to know how to safely use their gun, but then they also have the means in place to look for suicidal ideations among themselves or among their friends and their family members to keep individuals safe. And so if this bill progresses, we can all of this work that we have done with our partnerships with the Sporting Council and gun owners and range owners would be all for naught, because right now we have this really great system in place that has been a model for other states and other communities of how we can educate our gun owners. And I think that this is something that I'm really passionate about. I know my organization, as well as the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition, that this is one of those bills that can, if it is taken back, we would really fall backwards in our prevention efforts. And so I really would hope that those of you who are participating today, those of you who are listening, to reach out to your representatives and ask them and have conversations with them about this bill, and to vote against this bill, because this is one of the best moves we've made in suicide prevention with gun owners in the state of Utah in previous years.
Thank you for that. We have Jess Burnham from the YWCA, who works in prevention, coming up next, and they'll have some comments. I wanted to throw this out to the panel to be thinking about: how do we find numbers to text reps? Was one of the questions our audience has. And another one was, what will the impact of the NRA going bankrupt have on our communities? And I have also a question for Lex Scott, but let's first go to Jess, who has some comments as well. Thank you, Jess.
Thanks, Billy, and everyone who's commented on this question. Just to quickly touch on something that we've been talking about at the Y, which is very relevant to our work, is the need for Utah to implement strong firearm relinquishment laws, and really proactively ensure that people convicted of intimate partner violence relinquish their weapons once they're prohibited from owning them. Research shows that laws requiring perpetrators to turn in guns upon being prohibited are linked to 16% reduction in intimate partner gun homicides. And then specifically as it relates to HB 60, YWCA Utah has taken a position opposing HB 60 officially. And I would offer the information that the most comprehensive and rigorous study of concealed carry laws found that in states with weak permitting, violent crime rates were 13 to 15% higher than in states than if those laws had not been in place. And then as for HB 61, YWCA Utah has again taken a position of opposing HB 61, which to me, just thinking of the state of emergency. I mean, we're in a state of emergency currently with COVID, and we know that vastly exacerbates intimate partner violence. I would emphasize that women are more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner or ex-partner than by a stranger, and are at risk of homicide in their own homes. And research has found, and I believe, chance of a victim of homicide. And then I also would like to just mention that we've been at the YWCA, we have been in some conversations with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, and really our stance kind of in this partnership is that it is the responsibility of our systems and our political leaders to ensure that we are safe in our homes and our communities. And we feel that this requires responsible gun ownership, which therein requires robust education on gun safety, which will not be required if we do away with concealed carry permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. The next question we have is going to go to Lex, and there has been a couple questions from our audience listening on how people can get involved if they want to get involved with gun violence prevention, as well as how to get a hold of their senators. And so let's leave that out there as a finish for our folks that want to hear from you. But also, Lex Scott, there's a question specifically for you. Lex, if we were to disarm police, what do you see happening with our armed citizenry?
With our armed citizenry, I don't really understand the question. I think that in the movies, I think people watch a lot of Hollywood movies and they watch a lot of shows that perform cop worship, and that people think this is the Wild West and they think that police protect them. And with all due respect, I don't believe that. I believe that as a society, it has not been proven that crime rates directly correlate with the amount of police that there are, and that crime rates go up and down depending on police with guns in our neighborhoods. Crime is basically predicated upon poverty and education levels and access to things. And so when people say, well, there are a lot of people with arms, there are a lot of people with arms right now. And if they think, and people that believe that police are what is stopping these people from mass murdering everyone, they're mistaken. No. People have guns. And yeah, if there were not police, I guess the assumption or the implication is that without police, everyone would go wild and just start killing each other, and that is incorrect. So, you know, and in my defense, I said I would like them to have less than lethal weapons. And anyone after this panel can Google what a rubber bullet gun can do to someone. They're called less lethal for a reason. You know, I've seen one put a hole through a girl's cheek. But the purpose is that in the Pickievic case, one police officer had a lethal shotgun, another one had a less than lethal. They both shot at the same time. And we are hoping that if both officers had a less than lethal shotgun, you know, Pickievic would be alive today and more people would survive police interactions. So what do I think would happen if police didn't have weapons? I think more people would live and survive police interactions.
Thank you for that. And the other stuff that is just lingering in our question queues here a lot, or how do we get involved? How do we get a hold of our legislators? What can people do to help stop gun violence? So that's an open question for our whole audience. And, you know, I'd love for you, any one of you, to jump in when you're ready.
Can I say the legislator one, just how to get in touch?
Sure.
If you guys go to le.utah.gov, you can track the legislative session, and also you can contact your legislators. I do want to preface this with not all of the phone numbers and not all the email addresses that are on the site are active and working. Some of them are kind of funny. Some of them are their home phone numbers, like their real phone numbers, and some of them lead to interns. And I would just say Google, definitely Google until you find someone, and try different websites, but le.utah.gov is one way.
Steve Swenson, let's go to you.
Just to piggyback off of what Lex said, if you find out who your local representatives are, a lot of them have email newsletters that they send out pretty regularly, especially during the legislative session. So you can go and sign up for that and get almost weekly updates from your legislators about just kind of the general happenings of the legislature, as well as what specific things they're working on. And then I think the other thing would be how to get involved is just follow kind of all the organizations listed on the panel tonight, and just research it. And I think the fact that someone's here tuning in tonight shows that they've kind of taken the first steps and can continue on with that.
Thank you for that, Jen Oxborough. I know you've got lots to say about where people can go.
Yes, I do.
You're on the hill a lot.
To say about where people can go.
Every legislator knows you by name. You're either a thorn in their side or they're happy to see you, one or the other. But how can people get involved, and how can, especially there's a lot of bills up there. How can people get tracked down to the ones that are specifically about preventing violence, period? That's just your work.
Yeah, so I've done this work in 5 different states, and I really do think Utah has the best legislative website. You can search by keyword. So if there's something that you're interested in, so that le.utah.gov is a great resource to go to. You can search by legislator and see what bills they're running. There are a lot of different ways to go to that. Plus, many other organizations that have bill trackers and will tell you why they're opposing something or holding on something or supporting something. Reaching out to those legislators and trying to offer your feedback and also specific requests, like stay solution focused. If you have an idea, remember these legislators hear sometimes 1,200 bills in a session. And so they could hear a variety of different bills during the day. I find that they do deeply appreciate respectful commentary from their constituents. They want to know what you know, and they welcome that feedback as they're trying to represent you. We have a constituent-led council in Utah, so they're paid very little to do this work. Most of them are there because they want to provide some sort of public service. So getting in touch with them and understanding that they're trying to juggle a lot of different things. Many of them have other jobs and they're doing this work away from their families. So finding a way to have a conversation with them and share your concerns and understand where they're coming from too is really, really important. You can disagree with them. It's okay. Trust me, I have a lot. And as long as I think you do it in a way that is compassionate and fair, I find that they're pretty willing to listen to you. I've only had a microphone turned off on me once or twice. So, you know, they listen up, they do. But reach out to me too, if I can ever help support you in anything that you're trying to do or connect you with anyone. I'd be really happy to do that as well. So please share my contact information or find me at Allies with Families. You can Google my name, Jen Oxborough, and find me pretty easily through social media or online. And I'd love to support any of your listeners as well. Thank you for tuning in.
I believe our facilitators are leaving your websites for people to go to. So don't worry about those folks listening here can get involved by going to your websites, and they will be posted for our listeners. I'm going to go to Graceland last because I like to make sure that our youth get a chance to speak. And so Graceland, we're going to close with you. How can people get involved? One, with March for Our Lives, and what do you encourage people to do to help save lives, and especially our young folks from school shootings and all of those other things that you're constantly talking about?
For March for Our Lives, to get involved, we have a website, marchforourlivesutah.com. We also have a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook page under the same name, so we're always available to answer questions. Anyone that needs any questions from me personally, I'm on almost all social media forums as a teenager, so just search my name up. I'm usually there. My DMs are open. But for March for Our Lives, on our website, we have a newsletter that people can sign up for, and they can get notifications for all of the events we do. And we usually work in conjunction with other organizations, so we can work with them and keep you informed on not just our organization but other organizations. And March for Our Lives is working on a TikTok, actually, because there's a question from Lex Scott in the chat. We are working on a TikTok. We have not created it yet. There's a lot going on with the legislative session from our side. And just in general, to get involved is really stay informed and keep up with things that you believe strongly in. If you stay informed, there's usually opportunities for you to put yourself in a position where you can be heard and make a change.
Thank you to our panel, Bené Larson from Menominee, Utah, Jen Oxborough, Allies with Families, Graceland Bonham from March for Our Lives, Utah, Jess Burnham, who is with YWCA and works in prevention, Steve Swenson, Davis County Sheriff's Department, and Lex Scott, Black Lives Matter. I know that we can't hear you, but please give them a round of applause. And I'm going to turn this back over to Jade Velasquez. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Billy. That is such an awesome end to the night. I just want to thank everybody who was here. If you just stick with us for another couple minutes, I've just got a little bit of helpful information for everybody. So if you did tune in halfway through, caught the end of the program, on behalf of the Gun Violence Prevention Center of Utah, I want to thank all of our panelists for graciously giving their time for this discussion. I also want to thank our honored guest, Greg Jackson from the Washington, D.C. And our moderator, Billy Palmer from KRCL Radio. Great job. We hope that everybody enjoyed this presentation and you were able to learn a little bit more about public health crisis here in Utah related to gun violence. And there's so much that can be done to prevent gun violence that isn't being addressed. And together we can all make a difference. So we have to let our community leaders and lawmakers understand the urgency to address gun violence in our state. And I think our panelists really spoke to that today. So one last website plug, you can go to our website, gvpc.org, and click on the Join Us button to get updates on educational events, policy recommendations, and ways to become active in preventing gun violence here in Utah. And if you belong to an organization that's seeking justice or safety for members of your community, consider joining our statewide Gun Safety Coalition. If you have specific questions, you can email us directly at info@gvpc.org. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Hope you all have a great night.